This all started back in 2010 when I was just a young kid living in the rural outskirts of Oregon. Our house was nestled deep within a thicket of towering Douglas firs, a place that felt completely isolated from the rest of the world, despite being a short drive from the nearest town. It was a crowded home shared by me, my parents, my cousin Leo, my Aunt Sarah, and her husband. Life was quiet, predictable, and mostly defined by the endless green of the forest. During the work week, my mom stayed home to look after Leo and me while the other adults headed into the city. The air out there always had that sharp, clean scent of damp pine needles and rain, and it wasn't unusual to see a family of deer wandering through our backyard in the early morning mist. We spent most of our time playing in that house, often feeling like we were the only 3 people left on the planet. It was a peaceful existence until the shadows grew long. We only had one neighbor, a reclusive man named Mr. Henderson, who lived in a cabin half a mile down the gravel road. At that age, I never really questioned the isolation or why we lived so far from other kids. It was just my normal reality. Bugs, forest animals, and massive thunderstorms were part of the routine. However, the events of that specific Tuesday changed everything. It is a day that every single one of us remembers vividly, yet none of us remember it the same. In my memory, the day began with my mom braiding my hair in the living room. I can still feel the sensation of her fingers working through the strands while I sat there in a plain white t-shirt, staring out at the trees. Suddenly, the entire room shifted. The natural daylight vanished, replaced by a deep, suffocating red hue that seemed to bleed out of the very air. It wasn't a gradual change. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and drowned the world in blood. I remember the walls starting to glow with this unnatural intensity, and the polished floorboards looked like they were made of red-tinted glass. It certainly wasn't a sunset. The light was far too bright and moved much too fast for any celestial event. I looked up from my lap and felt the world slowing down to a crawl. It was as if time itself had been paused by an external force. I couldn't even hear the sound of my own heartbeat against the rhythmic thrumming. The uncovered windows in front of me became the source of this terrifying radiance. The light poured through the glass in thick, steady waves that felt almost physical, like a low-frequency hum vibrating deep inside my teeth. I tried to look at my mom for some kind of reassurance, but she was frozen in place, her hands still mid-braid and her eyes wide with a silent, glassy terror. It was like looking at a wax mannequin instead of my mother, and it chilled me to the bone. Across the room, Leo had backed himself into the far corner, his small frame trembling as he stared up at the ceiling with a look of pure vacancy. For a horrifying moment, I was convinced that the forest outside was engulfed in a massive fire and we were about to be consumed by the flames. But as I looked closer, I realized there was no smoke rising past the glass, and the air didn't feel warm at all. It was just a color of pure monochromatic red with no shadows. There were no shapes moving in the light, and absolutely no sound from the woods outside. Then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the crimson veil vanished. 1 second the world was red, and the next it was gone. Time seemed to slam back into its normal gear with a jarring physical sensation. The ticking of the wall clock rushed back into my ears, and I could hear the distant chirping of birds again. I stood there shaking, trying to find my voice to speak. I finally managed to ask my mom what had just happened, but she just stared at the window for a long time before whispering that she didn't know. The strangest part, however, came later when we tried to talk about it. Her version of the event didn't match mine at all. She claimed she wasn't doing my hair. She insisted she had been helping me with my math homework at the kitchen table when the light hit. She swore she grabbed us both and hid in the pantry. She remains certain to this day that something was standing right outside the window, watching us through the red glare, even though she never saw a physical form. We have compared these memories dozens of times over the last decade, and she never wavers on the details of her story. I am just as certain about my own version. Leo, on the other hand, refuses to talk about that day. Whenever the subject comes up, he gets incredibly uneasy and shuts down. The only thing Leo ever admitted was that the light felt like it had actual weight, pressing down on his chest and making it impossible to breathe. Beyond that, he remains a vault of silence. As the years pass, the event refuses to leave our minds. We sometimes joke about being abducted and return with scrambled memories to cope with the fear, but my mom still tenses up whenever she sees a red light. She can't even stand the sight of a red holiday lamp now. If I ever turn on a red night light in the hallway, she gets visible anxiety and demands that I shut it off immediately. A few years ago, I found a local archive online mentioning several strange sightings in our old county during that same month. People reported bleeding skies and silent objects hovering over the tree line. We moved away long before I found that article, but reading those accounts made my stomach drop. I never saw a craft, but I felt the world change. I spent the better part of my childhood in a quiet suburban pocket of North Carolina, right on the edge of the Appalachian foothills. When you grow up in the South, you learn very quickly that the deep woods aren't a playground for the reckless. My older sister, Chloe, and I were raised with one unbreakable rule: never, under any circumstances, venture into the forest alone. The trees there felt ancient and watchful, as if they were guarding secrets better left undisturbed. We ended up moving away when I was 8 years old, but the events that occurred right before we left are still burned into my mind. I had a friend named Maya over for a playdate on a humid Saturday afternoon. We were hanging out in my backyard, which had a very peculiar layout. The lawn sloped down at a sharp, steep angle and ended abruptly at the edge of a massive shadowed forest. It was a beautiful spot, but the geography made it feel strangely disconnected from the house. Because of the steep hill, once you descended toward the tree line, you couldn't hear anyone talking on the back deck unless they were screaming at the top of their lungs. There was a small, narrow trail winding deep into the thicket of oaks and pines, looking like a dark tunnel leading into another world. Being young and full of curiosity, we decided it would be fun to explore just a little bit. We didn't bother running back up the hill to tell my parents our plan. We just slipped into the shadows of the canopy, feeling the temperature drop instantly. At first, everything seemed perfectly fine. We played among the roots, threw sticks into the creek, and laughed at the squirrels. But as we turned around to head back toward the house, the atmosphere shifted. I heard a distinct sound nearby, the sharp snap of a heavy branch and the rhythmic thud of footsteps following us. A heavy, sickening feeling settled deep in my stomach. It felt like we were being hunted by something that knew exactly where we were. Maya didn't say a word, but her face went pale, and she didn't argue when I whispered that we needed to hurry back to the clearing. Just as we reached the very edge of the dense forest, I heard a familiar voice drifting through the trees. It was my mother's voice, calling out my name from somewhere deep within the dark thicket. She sounded pained, as if she were hurt and needed help. The voice was unmistakable. It had the exact same tone and soft southern lilt that my mother possessed. It froze me in my tracks. My head was telling me that I had to go back into the darkness to save her, but my gut was screaming at me to run as fast as I could. I actually took a few tentative steps back toward the source of the voice before Maya grabbed my arm with a grip like iron. In that moment, the strange spell that had fallen over me finally broke. My heart was slamming against my ribs, as Maya pointed her finger back up toward the sun-drenched deck of our house. When I looked up, I saw my mother standing there in the light, waving at us and holding a box of popsicles. I could barely hear her faint voice calling us for a snack, but Maya had seen her walk out from the kitchen just seconds before. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We didn't wait another second. We bolted up that hill. We sprinted until our lungs burned, and when we finally reached the safety of the porch, I asked my mom if she had been in the woods at all. She frowned and shook her head, explaining that she had actually been taking a nap inside the house. She said she woke up suddenly with a weird, nagging feeling that she needed to check on us immediately. I never told her about the voice I heard in the trees. I didn't want to see the look of terror on her face. I think she already suspected that something wasn't right in those woods, and I didn't want to confirm her worst fears. That night, after she tucked me in and turned out the light, I lay awake staring out the window toward the silhouette of the tree line. The moonlight was just bright enough to reveal the jagged shapes of the forest and the black outlines of the branches swaying in the wind. Everything looked normal for a few minutes until I saw a flash of movement. A darker, fluid shape slid between the trunks, moving with a liquid grace that didn't look human or animal. It paused for a second and then turned its head toward my window, as if it knew I was watching it from the darkness of my room. I immediately ducked under the covers, trying to convince myself that it was just my overactive imagination playing tricks on me. After that night, I never slept with the blinds open again, even after we moved to the city. In the weeks leading up to our move, the woods continued to make me feel uneasy. Sometimes I would catch a flash of something pale darting between the trees during the day, or I'd hear what sounded like heavy breathing just outside my bedroom wall. A few days before the moving truck arrived, my mom mentioned finding deep claw marks on the back door. They were thin, jagged scratches carved just below the handle, as if something had been testing the lock. She tried to tell herself it was just a stray raccoon or a hungry neighborhood dog, but we both knew the truth. My fair warning to anyone visiting the rural parts of the South is to stay out of the woods after the sun begins to set. The locals know exactly what I'm talking about, even if they don't like to say the name out loud. Some things in this world are experts at mimicry, and they are always waiting for an invitation to come inside the house. Back when I was in the 5th grade, I learned exactly what it meant to be truly alone in a house that suddenly felt like a trap. I don't tell this story often because it lacks the supernatural polish of ghosts or aliens, but it is far more terrifying because it was real. It was 1998, and my little sister, Maya, and I had both come down with a brutal case of the chickenpox during the same week. We were blotchy, itchy, and absolutely miserable. Maya was younger and didn't quite understand personal space. She insisted on staying right next to me, making us play cards and board games even when she was running a high fever. Within 24 hours, I was covered from head to toe in red spots. My mother actually seemed relieved in that classic 90s way, saying it was better for us to just get the illness over with at the same time. She did her best to manage the chaos before heading off to her shift. The routine was consistent: oatmeal baths, thick layers of pink calamine lotion, and lukewarm ginger ale to settle our stomachs. Since both of my parents worked long hours, they had to leave us on our own. My dad would be out of the driveway before the sun even touched the horizon. My mom would stay just long enough to make us some burnt toast, measure out our medicine, and tape a list of emergency phone numbers to the refrigerator door. On this particular morning, my mom kissed Maya on the forehead and looked at me with a serious expression, telling me I was old enough to keep an eye on things. At 11 years old, those words made me feel like I had just been handed the keys to a kingdom. I felt ancient and responsible, convinced that I was basically a man now that I had been put in charge of the household. It was an exciting feeling until the silence of the empty house began to set in. The house was filled with the usual domestic symphony, the heater ticking in the walls, the pipes knocking, and the refrigerator giving its low, rhythmic moan every few minutes. These were safe, familiar sounds that usually brought comfort. Maya and I spent the morning building a massive fort out of every blanket we could find in the linen closet, which we jokingly named Fort Itchy. It was our sanctuary from the boredom and the constant urge to scratch. Crawling around inside the soft fabric was actually a clever way to soothe our skin without using our fingernails and causing scars. We spent an hour arguing about which VHS tape to watch next, and she eventually wore me down until I agreed to play a colorful animated musical. I booed for 5 minutes straight just to maintain my dignity, but deep down, the distraction was a welcome relief from the sharp waves of itching that reminded us we were currently diseased. I actually enjoyed the novelty of being out of school and having the entire place to ourselves. Every now and then I would catch our reflections in the dark glass of the television screen, 2 little speckled goblins, half-dressed and covered in pink lotion, just trying to make it through the day. It felt like a small, strange vacation with only a few simple rules. Stay put, don't scratch the scabs, answer the phone if it's Mom, and always keep the door locked. I remember the surge of pride I felt as I slid the deadbolt into place after my mother left for work. By mid-morning, the Pacific Northwest sun had managed to break through the clouds, turning the light through our curtains into a dusty gold. The entire house smelled like a mixture of lavender oatmeal and medicinal rubbing alcohol. Maya was humming to herself on the sofa, kicking her legs restlessly while the movie credits rolled. I thought the day would be harmless. I had no idea that the house could suddenly change sides, and I certainly didn't know that family members could be more dangerous than strangers. The morning started normally enough. Mom called around 9 to check in, and I told her we were doing fine. She mentioned she might grab some soup on her lunch break and try to sneak home early. I told her not to worry, using my best big man voice, while Maya remained glued to the bright flickering of the TV. While Maya was occupied, I decided to take a quick shower to try and quiet the burning sensation on my skin. The water beat against the bathroom tile, creating a steady and safe rhythm that drowned out the rest of the world. But the moment I shut the faucet off, a heavy, dead silence dropped over the house. I called out for Maya, expecting a playful shout in return, but I didn't get an answer. I dried off quickly, a cold knot of dread forming in my chest. I got dressed in a hurry and walked into the hallway, where I found Maya leaning over the back of the couch, her face pressed tight against a window pane. "What are you doing?" I whispered, but she didn't turn around. She just pointed toward the driveway and said, "Uncle Silas is here." The news caught me completely off guard. Silas was my father's brother, a man who was frequently unstable, often intoxicated, and always entirely unpredictable. I moved to her side and peered through the blinds. His rusted old truck was parked at a jagged angle in our driveway, leaking oil onto the concrete. Silas was already out of the vehicle, stomping through the yard in a dirty denim jacket and rummaging through the storage bins near our garage. He lifted a heavy gas can and a bundle of extension cords, tossing them carelessly into the back of his truck. It looked like he was just borrowing things again. I watched through a crack in the blinds, hoping he'd simply grab his tools and leave like he always did. But suddenly Silas turned and headed straight for the porch. "Get down," I whispered to Maya, and we both collapsed onto the floor behind the back of the couch, holding our breath. I heard his heavy boots crunch along the path, and then the porch steps groaned under his weight. The front door creaked, and I heard the lock click. He still had a spare key. The door closed behind him with a quiet, yet somehow final sound that sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed Maya's hand and mouthed a command to follow me upstairs. We moved as quickly as we could, taking the creaky stairs as fast as we could, and locked ourselves in my room with a flimsy latch. Silence fell downstairs, broken only by the hiss of a beer being opened, echoing down the empty hallway. He felt like he owned our house, and that scared me more than anything. Maya trembled next to me, her eyes filled with tears as she asked why he was there. I pressed my ear to the floor vent to hear what was going on downstairs. I could hear him rummaging around in the living room, throwing tapes and valuables into a plastic bag. It became clear he hadn't come to borrow tools, but to rob his own brother. After a while, the television turned on downstairs, and I heard the sound of another can being opened. It seemed he'd decided to settle in for good, and time dragged painfully slowly for us. Our skin burned with the itch of chickenpox, but we were afraid to even move for fear of giving ourselves away. Finally, the television faded, and the footsteps ceased. Only the familiar hum of the refrigerator remained. I whispered to my sister to stay in the room, but she, overcome with fear, followed me. When we got downstairs, the air was thick with the pungent smell of alcohol and sweat, foreign to our otherwise pristine home. I carefully stepped around the overturned chairs, feeling my heart pounding in my teeth with mounting tension. The kitchen was in a terrible state. Every drawer had been pulled out, the refrigerator had been gutted, and food was scattered across the floor. The living room was equally chaotic, but Silas himself was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly I heard his muffled, unpleasant laughter coming from my parents' bedroom. I crept to the doorway and peered inside, seeing a scene that made my blood run cold. He was standing by my mother's dresser, rummaging through her personal belongings, a crazed expression on his face. He pulled something out of a drawer, sniffed it, and shoved it into his pocket with a grin. A gasp of indignation and fear escaped me, and the sound immediately betrayed our presence. Silas whirled around, his eyes red, wet, and completely wild. "What the hell are you doing here?" he growled, and for a second we froze, staring at each other in mute horror. Then he lunged at us, and in that moment he ceased to be our relative. The first thing he threw was a tin can, which hit the doorframe and spattered the carpet with foam. "Get over here, you little freaks!" he screamed, chasing us down the narrow hallway. He crashed into walls and knocked our family photos off the walls, turning the house into a war zone. We burst into the kitchen, our socks sliding on the linoleum, slowing us down. His hand grabbed my shirt, missing by just a few centimeters, and I could feel his putrid breath on my neck. Silas always had bad teeth, and the smell of rot followed us as we raced through the house. I yelled at Maya to run for the door, and we sprinted through the dining room, skirting the table, hoping to reach the stairs, but he was too fast. Seeing that the stairs were blocked, I yanked Maya toward the back door instead. Silas was right on our heels, slamming into the kitchen counter with enough force to shatter the wood. The back door was stuck tight, swollen from the humidity, but I threw my entire weight against it while fumbling with the lock. It finally burst open, and the cool morning air rushed in as we flew off the porch and into the yard. Behind us, I heard the door frame splinter as he crashed through it like a wild animal. In that moment, I felt like I was being hunted by a monster from a nightmare rather than a human being. We sprinted for the wooden fence at the edge of the property, the ground tearing up beneath our feet. Silas was shouting incoherent threats and curses, his voice ragged with rage. I managed to push Maya up and over the top board, and she tumbled onto the dirt on the other side. As I tried to swing my leg over, a hand clamped onto my ankle with a crushing grip. I screamed at him to let go, kicking wildly and desperately until my heel connected with something soft. Silas grunted and fell back into the grass, giving me just enough time to roll over the fence and hit the dirt. The world suddenly went quiet except for the sound of Maya sobbing uncontrollably. Then a stern voice cut through the air from the neighboring yard. "Hey, what's going on over there?" It was Mr. Miller, our next-door neighbor, holding a garden tool. I shouted for help, telling him that someone had broken into our house. Silas came staggering around the side of the fence, his face flushed a deep purple, and the veins in his neck bulging like thick pipes. Mr. Miller didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and told Silas he better get the hell out of there before things got worse. For a tense second, nobody moved. Then Silas began screaming again, throwing rocks and a plastic lawn chair at us in a blind, drunken fit. Mr. Miller told us to get inside his house immediately and turned back to Silas, claiming he was armed. That finally stopped the man in his tracks. He stood there for a moment, chest heaving, glaring at us with pure hatred. He spat on the grass and growled a message from my father before stomping back to his truck and peeling away in a cloud of exhaust. I stood there shaking, my lungs screaming for air, and my skin crawling under the scabs of the chicken pox. The police arrived shortly after, but the damage was already done. The house was a wrecked. Beer cans littered the floor, drawers were dumped out, and my mother's dresser had been completely overturned. When my parents finally arrived, my mom hugged us so hard it actually hurt. My dad's jaw locked tight when the officers asked if he wanted to press charges against his own brother. Silas was eventually found passed out in his truck 2 towns away and spent a week in jail. We never saw Silas again after that week, but the feeling of safety never truly returned to that house. My mom changed the locks immediately, and my dad installed heavy-duty security doors and motion lights. Maya wouldn't sleep alone for months, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. I tried to act tough, but I'd often wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear the sound of his heavy boots on the stairs again. It's terrifying how quickly the concept of home can disappear. One minute you're a kid in pajamas eating toast, and the next you're realizing that the world can be a very dark place. I'm 40 years old now with a family of my own, and I still double-check the deadbolts every single night. I tell my kids never to open the door for anyone, not even people they think they know. They think I'm paranoid, and maybe I am, but I know how fast the monsters can get inside.